Let me introduce you the three panelists. On my left, I have Emmanuelle Assouan, who is Deputy Director General for Financial Stability at the Banque de France and is responsible for all the climate policies at the Banque de France. To the left of Emmanuelle is Sylvie Goulard, who used to be at the Banque de France and is now co-chairing the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, the hot new topic. So we'll be looking forward to Sylvie's comments on that. And on the left of Sylvie, we have Beatrice, Weder de Mauro, the president of CEPR. And so Beatrice thought that it would be helpful to start the panel with a general presentation. She has put together maybe a few slides because this is, of course, a very difficult, very complex issue, and so she will lead the way. Why don't you go ahead, Beatrice?
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about this, something that we have been thinking about very, very much over the last months. And I say here it's part of work with Estelle and Eric Lombin, Estelle Cantillon, Eric Lombin, without implying them too much because this is very much work in progress. It is what I'm going to be presenting is a stepping stone on the way to a paper which is about designing markets for provision and conservation. And we do have, the ideas of how to solve it, but I here want to briefly discuss more the problems that we need to understand before solving them, namely understanding the confusion that reigns around here, the confusion of words, the confusion of concepts, and the interlinkages. So let me jump right in. Here is part of the confusion. Carbon and nature markets are often many of them and many of the topics around here have sort of been created spontaneously. Yes, there are, of course, the compliance markets for carbon. Those are not in scope here. It is everything else, from voluntary carbon markets to nature-positive solutions. 60,000 people go to these COPs, both the biodiversity and the climate COPs, and it is not really something that is dominated by academics, typically, and by academic thinking. It is much more of a spontaneous mushrooming of solutions and also standard setters, etc. Nature and carbon are often sold as a bundle. And here is an example. These are two examples of something that you can buy as an offset from Weder. Planting biodiverse forests in Panama at $38 a ton. Now, a ton of what? A ton of CO2. Now, of course, the animal there is not measured in tons of CO2, and neither is the biodiversity measured in tons of CO2. And there is more problem. So how do we measure biodiversity? There are about 600 different measures and maybe agreed on some 15 that may be relatively good measures. But what seems to be emerging as a sort of emerging consensus is that it has something to do with area. And it is quality weighted area that somehow is important when you're coming to nature. So obviously we already have very different dimensions for the two. There are important similarities in both cases. We are talking about common. In the case of nature, there is more of an aspect also of a local common, but there is a global common aspect also to the biodiversity. And obviously for climate and warming, it is a global common. There are differences that make the question of design important. So while a ton is a ton is a ton, no matter where it's emitted or extracted in the world, nature is not nature is not nature. Wherever you destroy nature, you cannot simply replace it somewhere else. And there is a problem of stock versus flow. So one is a flow problem, the other is a stock problem. And when you're looking at nature, and this is one thing, it took me a long time to understand, talking also to the people who actually do the science of forests. How does this shape look like? It's stylized, so you notice there are no tons on the curve. But generally speaking, it's important to understand that what is particularly useful for removing carbon, namely a young forest, and has a very high productivity in terms of removing carbon, because this is where a lot of carbon is being fixed in the growing material, is not so valuable in terms of biodiversity. There is also a flow and an increase in biodiversity there, but the flow here is big in the young forest, and it's on the old forest, the further flow into the soil is still positive, it seems, but it is not very large. So here we're talking mostly about the stock, and it is about the conservation problem, a stock of CO2 that is the carbon sink that needs to be, that makes this valuable. And in terms of biodiversity, it is also a stock, whereas this curve here is much steeper at the beginning. So you already see that planting trees and conserving areas, stocks and flows, don't have the same effects on biodiversity and on climate. Here is a matrix that I find useful to try and sort out some of the things that are already existing out there. It's a matrix that tries to map existing project solutions and things that are on offer into climate positive, neutral, and negative. And the same for biodiversity, positive, neutral, and negative. So here is where we are currently sitting as a planet, because nature on net is actually a contributor to CO2 emissions. So in other words, it is climate negative, and since a lot of this is from deforestation, it is on net, right? It is a sink, but on net there is more deforestation and emissions than it is sunk. So, and this is of course also biodiversity negative. So this is where we are. Here are the provision markets. What is a provision market? Well, it is where carbon removal is paired with a positive flow of biodiversity. This one here is a bit different. This is about avoidance of emissions, and that's what a lot of the offset markets actually do. And finally, I will also focus on this one, just briefly show the differences here. So a provision market is one where we are both removing carbon, so it's positive on climate, and it is positive in terms of increasing biodiversity. What are examples of this? Natural reforestation, revegetation, growing mangroves, regenerative agriculture can all have features of this positive and positive. And moreover, in many cases, it is actually inseparable. Right? It's a bundle. Now, here is the difficulty. A lot of the voluntary carbon market as it exists right now is not of the extracting type. What it is actually selling is carbon relative to a baseline. And the baseline, think of a threatened forest. The baseline needs to be established. If the threat materializes, then this is the baseline. And if we conserve it, this is what is the outcome. And then this is sold as a ton of carbon. Now, notice that this might well be also negative. It may actually be still contributing to emissions on the whole. It's just relative to a hypothetical flow that was avoided. So it is a counterfactual problem, and it's not surprising to economists that counterfactuals are difficult to establish, and that there is a huge industry that doing nothing else than trying to establish standards and then measuring and verifying these standards. And that's also where a lot of the problems come from, a lot of the scandals, what is then, is a scandal, treated as a scandal, overselling of carbon, baselines that were not well defined and turned out to be erroneous ex post, etc. So relative to baseline is not really it is climate positive relative to baseline, but it's not extracting carbon. And in terms of biodiversity, there it's good because we are protecting something. Something of the stock is protected if this part is realized rather than this. Now let me show you a last one. So I'm not going to go into the conservation and the other. Most of these other places of the matrix also have solutions. Some of them are technical, not natural. But this one here is a regulation in the UK that has been in effect for now about a year or two. And it is about compensation. Now, I put it in the climate neutral, biodiversity neutral. It may not be fully neutral because in fact the intention is it is a biodiversity net gain regulation. What is it about? It's if there is an unavoidable loss, and this is defined, what is unavoidable, a developer builds something somewhere and has to unavoidably destroy some biodiversity, some biodiverse ecosystem. Now, he can do this if he or she is compensating with a biodiversity unit that can be bought on the market in the UK only locally. This is not a global system. And there is a formula behind it. There is a spreadsheet which is complicated, but somehow has a formula around this type area. Biodiversity is area times quality. You see that the pricing, here finally we do have prices for some biodiversity only. The pricing is quite different depending on where the location of this area is and what kind of initial quality, habitat distinctiveness measures are being applied here. But generally speaking, such a biodiversity credit in the UK is not super cheap, right? So you see, this is also called a nature credit, and then there are other types of solution that I was talking about before that have similar names but mean something completely different. Which is why I was suggesting that it's very important that we start out by clarifying what we are talking about, and then the next step can be to, actually get solutions. And I'm just flashing this here. I'm actually gonna leave this for the discussion, in what direction we're thinking in terms of solution.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Very helpful, very important to set the context correctly. I would like to next let Emmanuelle give her remarks. Before you give your remarks, I just want to remind everyone, we are here in a special place. Banque de France, I was just told, has now officially been recognized as the leading central bank in the world for all its work it does on climate and nature. And Emmanuelle is very much responsible for a lot of these policies. That's the first thing I want to say. Second thing is why it's special. We're close to a 10-year anniversary of the Climate Paris Agreement. This was a completely it's such an important event that completely transformed how we look at the climate emergency and how we address it by engaging all the relevant players around the world in a global response. So we need to mark that moment. 10 years after Paris is a good time to assess what have we accomplished and what do we still need to do, and how are future actions going to be affected by a different world we live in, a fragmented world with huge geopolitical issues and much less consensus on these questions than we had 10 years ago. Emmanuelle.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And Many thanks for those kind of words of introduction. So maybe I will try to take the cue of what you have just said about the climate actions of central banks and supervisors, making the link with Beatrice's developments on nature, because our next frontier as central bankers responsible for monetary policy and price stability, supervisors in charge with bank supervision and insurers supervision in charge with financial stability, is to take into account in our mandates, in the context of our mandates, price stability, financial stability, the impacts of climate, because we know, and now it's a no-brainer, it was mentioned, the Paris Agreement, and afterwards, 2 years after the foundation here very close nearby of the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, in 2017. It was a narrow agreement at that time, and it is now a full and very large agreement that climate change is a risk, both for price stability and financial stability. Which means that the NGFS, we were 8 of us. We are now more than 140 members, almost 100 countries represented and participating actively in this network, plus an addition of more than 20 members, acting very actively on the diagnosis. It is well known now, but also the development of a toolbox in order to help central banks and supervisors to achieve the right action in order to set the right signals and the right dynamic or stimulus in order to limit the risks for the financial system in terms of the impacts of climate change, either transition risks or physical risks. So as far as the toolbox, we have a lot of things developing, and one of our flagship and what we consider as a very important public good, because it goes beyond the community of central bank and supervisors, is the way we develop scenarios in order to feed and allow prospective and forward-looking capacity of risk assessment, which is needed because of the risks happening in the future and the lack of statistical data and enough statistical event, even though it's multiplying over the last few years. What we have done is, since 2017, we have published, framed scenarios relying on a lot of scientific basis, and we have just released last November the 5th vintage of those scenarios, where we have quite a new achievement, which is not a pleasant one at all, where we revised upward the consequences of climate change on GDP losses over time, 2050 to 200, and where we see that we have had to multiply by 2 to 4 the GDP losses at the global level that we consider we will have to face at those time horizon because of physical shocks. Which means that by 2050, we consider that the GDP losses at the global level will be like 15% of GDP, which is 3 times higher than when we considered with the previous vintage 2 years ago. So we have a capacity which is with a refinement of the tools, with the refinements of the research, to consider that the materiality of the losses are more and more important. This is due to new damage functions which onboard in a much better way a larger set of climate events, and which also take better into account the persistency of the shocks, the persistency of the effects of the shocks, where with the first scenarios, the first vintages, were only one-off shocks with no persistency and no latency. So that's a very important aspect which I would like to share and which I share, and which should deserve a lot of additional work and a lot of thorough thinking about what we should do altogether in order to accelerate transition, because what we take also from those scenarios is that the cost of transition is a very, very minor cost compared to unmitigated climate change. When we take a baseline scenario with a net zero at 2050 horizon, there is a loss of GDP, but the loss of GDP, which is like 8% at the global level, is split into 7% of physical shock loss and 1% of transition related loss. So there's no hesitation to have about the need to invest in transition. And here we consider that we are not there yet, considering the fact that at the global level, when we come to financing the transition, we have a huge gap, $1.3 trillion at the global level being spent on the financing climate change, whereas the needs are 10 times higher, like 13 trillion, that the financing flows are very biased towards advanced economies, towards China, not enough at all vis-à-vis emerging economies, and that the finance is not aligned at all with Paris agreement and Paris-based objectives. We consider in Banque de France and CEPR that the securities held in the financial institutions in France, for an example, only 1% of those securities allow to finance activities which are aligned with the taxonomy, which is too little. So here, a strong call for action at the European level in order to enhance the financing of climate at the European level. That's what we should aim at with the Capital Market Union, but also at emerging countries in order to facilitate and to de-risk the climate financing vis-à-vis those countries.
Thank you. So since you are raising the point about the financing gap, let me ask the question to Sylvie. What should we do about it? And what does it imply in terms of the risks that are in the financial system?
Okay, thank you, Patrick, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm glad to be back here. I see some faces in the room, people I worked with, and I learned a lot on all these issues. I took my little part in the enlargement of the NGFS when I was here. First, it's very important that economists and people dealing with finance enter this field, because there is something invisible in our economies, and it is natural capital. We make as if it was possible to run a company with capital and workforce, when actually you need much more than that. You need a lot of ecosystem services, you need water, you need workforce in good health, etc., etc. And you need many commodities. So first of all, it is serious, and it is not only a topic for scientists, it is something that has to do with business, finance, and finance is the science of measuring risks. So welcome on board, we need all your brains, and the more people will dig on this, the better, because it is complex. My second point is that I'm glad that we are discussing credits, but governments are not doing what they are supposed to do. We are still spending a lot of money in harmful subsidies. So if you, and then I will tell you what I've been doing in the last 18 months on biodiversity credits. I really believe they can be part of the solution, but we should not fool ourselves. As long as 35% of the budget of the European Union goes to agricultural policy in a way that is not regenerative, we are making a huge mistake. We are wasting taxpayers' money, and it is very nice to come after as a supervisor, etc. But the main decision should be a political one, and it should be made seriously. And regenerative agriculture is already something functioning not only in India, where you have the Andhra Pradesh being the avant-garde, but also in certain parts of our countries. So it's serious, we need to deal with the question, and there are solutions, but there are more than one elephant in the room. The big elephant in the room is that governments have the tendency, and it's the same for climate, to say we need, of course we need the private sector, but it cannot be the private sector only or just private money. We need much more. So now what is the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits? It's a panel that was launched in June 2023 during the Paris Summit on the New Financing Pact. A group of 25 people, co-chaired by Dame Amelia Fawcett, a fantastic British-American lady, Franco-British Secretariat, but global in its scope and global in the composition of the panel, people from all around the world, China, India, Africa, South America, indigenous people, and if I may, Beatrice, we need the academics, and I thank you because you were also part of our knowledge group, and it was important for us to have a group of academia. But when you discuss with people in Brazil, when you discuss with people in Colombia, with indigenous people, they don't want only academics from the West. They really want a mix of academic knowledge and local knowledge, and some of them told us, you are teaching us Latin words of the plants we know better than you. So keep in mind that the solution can only be global. It requires, of course, a lot of research, and I respect it very much, but it requires also to respect the people on the ground. And actually, the key for all this, why are the carbon markets unperfect, to put it in a diplomatic way? Because they were often not conceived, managed with the people. The results were not verified on the ground, etc. So what we did with the IAPB was to start from one principle. We want to propose something which is high integrity. And as biodiversity is very complex, as you said, so we had several working groups on measurement, on demand, supply, stewardship, governance. You can have a look at the website of IAPB where the working group on measurement produced very interesting conclusions. For example, the idea that it is not possible to find one metric and that we should not even try. The logic we followed was to set the criteria of what a methodology should be. It should be something transparent. We should know where the data are coming from. There should be a depository. It should be verified, assurance, etc. Rather than trying to capture the methods, because first of all, it's going to evolve also with new technologies, be it satellites, be it IA, be it blockchain, and also traditional knowledge. So in some projects, you can have people on the ground making the verification. Elsewhere, it can be satellites. The important thing is that, for example, there is a third-party verification, etc. So the results is a framework we presented at the CALICOP with principles. We try not to reinvent the wheel, so we worked very closely with the WEF, the World Economic Forum, and also with BCA, the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. We managed to identify 3 groups of principles. One is that the outcome should be seriously verified for nature. Second, the people on the ground should be involved. And third, the markets should be efficient and work well. Of course, it's only a proposal, our framework. It's not something that is going to apply automatically, but we also have 31 pilot projects worldwide from private companies, NGOs, institutions, showing that there is a lot of interest. And we hope that we can be one of the solutions, one of the ways to channel private money for good projects on the ground. It's going, in our opinion, to be more, and you said it very eloquently, Beatrice, it's not something tradable, fungible. We don't believe we can have a secondary market, and people on the ground don't want it at all. So it is more project financing than a real market. But let's do all the efforts to develop locally very different pilots, and we can then have a look at the possibility to standardize some of the aspects, etc. So we are just at the beginning of the story. We hope that some governments are going to take the lead. Actually, when we organized consultation, because it was a really bottom-up approach, when we organized these consultations, the interesting thing was that quite from all around the world, people were asking from a public framework, a public control of what is happening on these markets, and some guarantees. So this was quite unanimous worldwide. So we hope that several governments are going to begin, that we can organize some exchange of good practices, some capacity building, and that's the reason why the support of the World Bank, of the GEF, of the European Commission, of the KfW, of AfD, and many others at Cali. And since then, I don't know what my mission is exactly, because I mean, there were some turbulences in the French politics, but we will see. They had other priorities than biodiversity, which is a mistake in my opinion, because long term it's more important than the political games. But anyway, in a nutshell, so it was an attempt to produce something that is not at all perfect, that will need improvement, but we need to hurry up. We need to hurry up. We need to take the question more seriously, not only because nature is important, but when I discussed with, for example, some of the CEOs of the companies that are our pilots, they know that their value chains are at risk. They know that the price of the commodities is increasing in a way that is bad news just before Christmas. Forget about chocolate in 10 years if it moves the way it is moving right now. So forget about coffee. These commodities could become something we cannot afford anymore. So these are excellent reasons to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvie. I think what Sylvie and Beatrice were saying, I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that, and there's a growing awareness that nature preservation, biodiversity preservation is a first order issue, and we have to include that in the climate, into climate policy, integrate it. So I think it's a very important development, and you're really at the frontier with your initiative. Now, both of you said it's important that academics get involved here, right? And so I guess you meant economists and maybe finance academics. I can tell you, I went to last week I was at a conference on biodiversity at MIT, and we were a few finance and economics professors, interested in the subject, trying to learn. And then there were a lot of people, biologists, ecologists, geographers, and so on. To them, like, well, what took you so long? And we've already occupied this space, and you didn't know what we were doing. So it's not so easy to get involved. But economics is critical. Economics is absolutely critical thinking. There are fundamental conceptual issues. For example, you said, well, we put integrity at the top as a important dimension. Before we even talk about integrity, it wasn't clear that when it comes to nature preservation, biodiversity preservation that it made sense to think in terms of a market response through credits, maybe offsets. Why? Because here's a concrete example. So for example, in the Amazon, you try and stop deforestation in one area. Okay, you get reforestation, you can maybe make that count as a carbon credit. But then what happens next is that all the equipment that was used to cut down trees, it's still there. It just gets moved somewhere else. And so you have leakage. And so you have destruction of forests somewhere else. And so in order to address this leakage problem, you can't rely on a market mechanism. It has to be some form of government intervention. So I think that's a big conceptual issue, so I want to put that on the table. And then before I'll let you respond to that, I had another question more for you, what you're doing at the Banque de France. You're doing, you mentioned scenarios, you mentioned climate stress test, but you also have a nature stress test. So I want to hear about, how do you approach that? How does one do a nature stress test?
Okay, thank you, Patrick, for the question. So we entered nature via climate, of course, because of the climate and nature nexus, which was explained by Beatrice. The negative feedback loop about deterioration in climate change, deterioration in nature, biodiversity. It's a vicious circle. What we do on the climate, if we do nothing on the nature side, and Sylvie was key in this type of, reflection and outcome, it is imperative to get into nature preservation and helping the restoration of nature and biodiversity. So we entered via climate, just in order to be effective in what we are doing, in order to preserve and have exactly the same type of modus operandi on nature. So we started 4 years ago via a diagnosis in order to consider whether nature loss, the attacks on biodiversity were of the same type of risks vis-à-vis financial stability and monetary policies and climate change. And the outcome of the work was, yes, indeed. It is exactly even the same type of channels through transition, through physical risks, through litigation, with the same type of shocks on losses of GDP, impacts on inflation, and as far as depreciation of activities, also steering a lot of losses for financial institutions, and thus, in addition, creating a lot of financial stability concerns with, of course, feedback loops on the macroeconomics. So it is the very same design that for climate shock. We have entered the subject via also the need to map what was the footprint of the financial system on biodiversity. So I think that with the DNB, the Dutch National Bank, we were among the first ones to map the footprint of the financial system, the French financial system, on the biodiversity. And what we had was a first series of figures mentioning that more than 40% of the credit portfolios of the banking system, plus the securities portfolios of the insurers, were heavily dependent on one critical ecosystem or more. which means that the disappearance or of one of those ecosystems were critical for the resilience of those activities. The ECB this year did exactly the same type of work, mapping that 75% of the exposures of the banking system at the European level was highly dependent on one ecosystem or more, natural ecosystem or more, which make them particularly vulnerable in case of degradation. And we know for sure that some frontiers have been already reached. In addition to that, we have had the same type of way forward. So not only the photo of the vulnerabilities, but also trying to forecast what we could face in the future if further deterioration is to expect what we expect. And we have set up a work in order to see how scenarios could help in this regard, adapting scenarios with nature risks. And this work has been done last year with a very concerning conclusion, which is that the models that are available currently are not fit and proper for that. And if I may continue a little bit, we have a very rich paper. I would like to make it public for you. It's December 2023, mentioning that we need to work all together on a better modelization in order to better encapsulate what we have as the local versus global interactions, which are very difficult to handle. The fact that biodiversity and nature is not a single metrics, the fact that the models are always trying to substitute another production factor which is not there, what was mentioned by Sylvie. And for that, we are trying to hard work in order to set up some models which could be a little bit of a shift of paradigm in order to address those
very important to do that, and you're pretty much setting the stage here for everyone. It's going to be super influential. But I want to make sure that we can collect a few questions from the audience as well. So Sylvie, why don't you go next?
I just wanted
briefly,
to make one observation, very short, on the methodologies. We are in uncharted territories. So the better is the enemy of the good. If you wait until you have the perfect models, the perfect scenarios, we will be all dead, okay? The WWF tells us that we may reach tipping point in 5 years. I don't know if it's true. I'm not a scientist. I'm just saying that the magnitude of risk and the magnitude of the problem for water, when I read, for example, in the French newspaper that more than half of drinkable water in France is no more drinkable, it's not about a minor issue. So I just wanted to make this point. So because I've heard so many times in this house and elsewhere, but we are not ready. No, we cannot publish this. It is not time. We are not. It will never be the right time. And we need also to change the way we think, to be much more modest, to test and test again, to do sandboxing, to accept that we fail. So when you say, Patrick, then sometimes economists, it's a matter of ego as well. You need to accept that you can make mistakes. And I don't know why, but there are much more women dealing with nature than in other fields.
Let me follow exactly from what you said. We need much more ambition, and it needs to be fast. Well, this is something we've been saying about climate for a long time. And now it's also the realization, it's also true for biodiversity and for nature. There is also another fact, that the distribution of really, really important ecosystems in this world is not equal across the globe. In fact, there are some that are concentrated in the poorest countries with a lot of other problems, and they are also tend to be not necessarily the biggest emitters. So that already suggests that there might be a deal there. But more importantly, what I was trying to emphasize from before, I think we are really on the wrong path. And Sylvie, I would really hope that your scheme actually succeeds in scaling, but a lot of the effort has been made in making the supply side as good as we can, in making the counterfactual as precise as we can. There is so much effort going into satellites and other types of more precise verification and trying to prevent the leakage in a completely fragmented and atomistic market. So maybe the whole thing has to be approached from a different perspective. On the supply side, so now I'm telling you in the direction that we are actually thinking, we need a much, much bigger approach, namely probably a jurisdictional approach. And it cannot be a multitude of little developers doing a little bit of mangrove here, a little bit of protection there, and at the same time trying to also deal with leakage, because you can't. Jurisdictional approach on the supply side, and then we need to talk about the other side that nobody talks about in all of this, in the whole attempt to make this market more credible, more trustworthy, and more integrity. It's all on the supply side. So where's the demand side? Are we just assuming that that once you have a beautiful biodiversity project, the funding is going to come automatically? Somehow there seems to be this assumption, because then there is always the say, oh, we philanthropy and blended finance will solve it. Well, it's not. Yeah. So
I think, Beatrice,
so let me just say the answer.
You both put the issues on the table here.
Mandatory.
I think Emmanuelle wants to quickly respond, and then I want to open it up to
maybe
for Q&As, because I think these are important issues to dig into.
Maybe a quick reaction on my side about the need to be ambitious and get to the next frontier on the models, which is indeed quite a long-term perspective, which doesn't impede us to advance on a very pragmatic way forward with impact analysis, which is on the financial stability side. So we will improve things step by step, and we are not shy in this regard to get lost and to and we did it in 2021. We were the first one to do stress tests with modest contributions, but it kickstart things for the others. And we are doing things also from a very operational perspective. So research is good and needed, and I call for all the different, bright minds in this regard to contribute. But what we do from a central bank perspective is also from an investor's perspective. And if we are ranked the first central bank in the G20, it's because we invest also on nature projects in order to restore marine biodiversity, because we have set up a fund, which is the first one in Paris and I guess almost in the world, in order to invest in biodiversity, enhancing also the methodology for financial investors. And we put some tokens like money, real millions, dozens of them, in order to fund projects, but also in order to steer and to stimulate the financial research by a practical approach. So I think it's twofold the way we should advance in this regard. Not only be in the research, it will not be enough. Public commitment is important. Yeah. The financial actors' commitment, and among them the central banks, is also very important.
Yeah. Let me add one comment to what you just said. So, I co-authored a report with Luis is sitting over there, and a few other co-authors on the Green Swan that Sylvie encouraged us to write. And at the time, everyone was saying, well, why are central banks getting involved in this? It's not part of the mandate. It's not, their role. Their role is monetary policy. What's amazing is that central banks have really moved into this and made major advances, the way you've described. And what really strikes me is that other branches of government where you think it's more their role, environmental agencies, fiscal authorities, what have they done that comes even close to what NGFS has done? Where are the climate scenarios, the nature scenarios done by ministries of finance, ministries of the environment? Okay, so this is really important to highlight. That's why I want to emphasize that. But I want to open up the floor, if I can say, to Q&As. I'm sure you have lots of reactions. You go first. You put your hand first. You need a microphone?
Thank you very much. So I wanted to ask about the demand side, as Bea recently brought up, because the idea of bringing in additional private finance is very appealing, but there is a big question about how much money, what's the quantum that it could really raise. I mean, we see at the moment an annual funding gap. If you think about, Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework called for an additional $700 billion per year to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And currently, the gap is about $942 billion, 0.9% of global GDP. So how much demand would there be, even with a jurisdictional approach? Essentially, this has got to be market creation through regulation on a really large scale to fill that kind of gap. So how could that be done?
So may I? Yeah. First of all, what Patrick said is true. So I repeat, we need to stop harmful subsidies. We need to have the right tax system. I know tax is a dirty word, but I use it. We are not pricing the externalities, etc. So then if you look at the private finance, what we did at IAPB, we had a working group on demand. We identified mainly, I leave the hybrid stuff with carbon, which is another, but for biodiversity, we identified 3 use cases. The first one is contribution, which is voluntary, the charities, but also companies. You have companies, because they are present in a country, they want to invest some money, or you have other companies that, for example, cannot have the assurance on traceability of the products they buy, so they decide to invest in a country. It's not compensation, but it is a little bit the same logic. I have to give something back. So first, contribution. Second, compensation. And here, we were very clear in our report. We are not in favor of offsetting, of wild offsetting. Offsetting cannot take place without condition, very strict conditions, without verification, etc. So local to local, ecosystem to ecosystem, fine, but no more. And with a mitigation hierarchy, obliging all infrastructure people piloting an infrastructure project to first try to avoid, then reduce the impact, and only as a residual stuff compensate. So no, I exchange WSTTs against whales, etc. No, but we have to be very clear, because offset is, and the last one, which is the most important, is insetting. I really believe that many companies are facing huge troubles because of the increase in cost and simply the fact that, well, for example, we have the coffee illy in our group of pilots. You are a coffee producer. Your coffee trees are in danger because of climate change and because of drought, etc. So you invest in your own value chain. And they were interested in measuring the biodiversity gain you can have. And one day it could be a kind of issuance of bonds linked to the insetting, so preservation of your insetting.
Yeah, that's a very interesting example. Yeah, Beatrice, I'll let you answer where the demand's going to come from, and then I want to collect a few other questions.
The demand can come for the flow, for the provision markets. The demand can come from offsetting, because if we make it compulsory to have actually these net zero targets, then offsetting. Now, offsetting is becoming a bad word, and so maybe one cannot use it anymore, but it's still, we need flows to come from the high emitters that are mitigating to those that are where there is the carbon removal. And this is what we're talking about here. It is about carbon removal. First, we have to start with all the things that are negative, that are subsidies, etc. Now, the other, and that's what you're talking about, is about stock. It's about the biodiversity conservation is what I would call that. And in biodiversity conservation, there is no offsetting. It has to be, but to the extent that it is a global common, it has to be financed globally, and how? Yeah. Through a tax.
There has to be a pricing,
the answer to the question of the demand is there has to be a tax, a global tax.
Yeah. There has to be ecosystem services pricing, absolutely.
But I'm always a little bit puzzled when we start with climate and add a little bit of biodiversity. I would recommend to give up this logic, really, because compensation, offsetting, even for climate. One question to the room. Do you really believe that it is that easy because we have one metric? Where are the progresses on climate? Because everybody is saying, no, climate is easy and biodiversity is very complex. Let's look at the problem the other way around. And if you look at, for example, the planetary boundaries of Rockström, what I like in this approach is that climate is one of the questions we face where we show that there is a limit. So let's be very, very careful, because to be honest, I've spent months with people who hate the way we talk about offsetting, be it on carbon, be it on nature. And this is important to listen to the people in the South who are against.
Right.
So let's rethink a little bit, if I may.
No, this is a critical policy debate here, absolutely. But there was a question from Jan Peter over there, and then I'll want to collect another question over there. 3 questions, and because we're almost time's up.
So I think my question is about feasibility. So really, can it be done on a larger scale? We have I think, very nice outcome from the Montreal conference 2 years ago, which has the 30-30 range, which I found is astonishing result. Why don't we work on this and try to make this work? On the other, if you look at capital markets nowadays, everybody is retreating from climate finance. I mean, we are a bit discussing that you are discussing the same way you did 3 years ago, maybe, but the climate has completely changed.
Okay, you had a question up there, yeah?
Can I just ask you to explain a bit more, Beatrice, what you mean by your jurisdictional approach? Some of us will not be familiar with the equipment that you're wanting to bring to the discussion.
And one last question over there. Yeah, go ahead.
Let's try the microphone. I am the National Bank of Belgium, and what I was wondering is, if you tie the NGFS scenarios, climate and nature together, there's a concern that, if you want to look at transition risks, say the Fit for 55 effects on risks, and you mix that up with nature, and you have scenarios that are not individually run, you make the issue murkier analytically rather than more tractable. Isn't that a concern if you tie that together?
Great. Emmanuelle, maybe 2 quick response, and then...
2 quick response. Yeah. Maybe on the very first question about funding nature, I think we have to trigger among the financial actors that it is worth financing nature. We have a lot of climate economics, a lot of climate value. We lack a little bit of a scenario with nature economics, even though we are working currently in Banque de France on artificialization, and we see that we have a lot of value to get from the recycling of urban wasteland, for instance. And we have measured that if we set up a business, which means money, which means attracting funding, it could allow to limit or rehabilitate a lot of land, which would be up to 6 years of artificialization according to the current trend in France. So there is already some, possible avenues to explore, which could be alluring for investors and from a business perspective. On the NGFS scenarios, we will proceed with the nexus, climate-nature nexus, in order to be coherent with climate and nature scenarios. So meaning that we will enrich, and at the very beginning, because we are not contemplating a jardin à la française, you know, a French garden, like it was said by Sylvie, we cannot target the complete and very well-designed scenarios. We are going to proceed in a stepwise fashion, you know, impacting or developing some part of the scenarios with nature consideration at the right level, local versus global. It will be limited in order not to overdevelop the nexus or the developments which could be which could interfere a little bit too much with the climate aspects. So modest approach first, and afterwards developing nature scenarios per se by their own, in order to adequately identify the risks that are not only climate, but also standing on a standalone basis.
So maybe on the feasibility, Deutscher Realismus, Jan-Peter, to be honest, I wonder if we can succeed with the tools we have, with our minds. I really believe we need to change very deeply the way we look at macroeconomy. We need to introduce, in a way or another, natural capital in the way companies report their results. That's the reason why CSRD is of the utmost importance. It is a strategic tool. It is going to give us the data. You can like it or dislike it. There are many CEOs now throughout Europe taking very strange positions. Okay, maybe some of the conditions are too heavy. One can always look at the legislation. But if we give up, it's committing suicide. I'm very sorry, but right now I'm worried by the positions taken by very important people in the political debate or in the industry, saying that all this is bureaucratic bullshit and that we should not go this way. We are fortunate, we are very lucky in Europe that with the Green Deal, at least we had a comprehensive vision. We can use the strength of the single market to, for example, the deforestation law is an important one, because if we don't use the strength of the European market to avoid deforested wood, for example, the representative of the people of Amazonia who was in my panel, and many people I met in Cali, they were thanking Europe for taking these decisions. Maybe the governments in Brasilia or elsewhere, I don't want to put the blame on one country, are against. Big industries in these countries are against, but on the ground, people say if Europe allows us to have the possibility to avoid this kind of export, then we will manage to save our forests. So we are in front of highly political issues, and I'm worried that, because the debate is no more on the modalities. In a democracy, you can agree or disagree. We do it this way, we do it another way. We are in a state of denial. And not only the extreme parties are pushing for ideas that are bringing us nowhere, but they are simply saying, well, we don't look at it, we don't deal with it. We want to continue to produce cars or chemicals or whatever. These models are over. And to go back to the question of the jurisdiction, it's an excellent one. The jurisdictional approach means that, as I understand it, that governments take their responsibility. For example, financial markets are organized everywhere worldwide with national rules in European rules, and then you have exchanges at the FSB or elsewhere to harmonize a little bit. But you want to I can give you my position. I really believe that the way in which we are politically organized on Earth is going to contribute to the destruction of Earth. We put nationalism before the interest of our children. We put structures, non-functioning structures, before our interest. On this, unfortunately, I have no answer, but I can tell you, if you want to fight for climate, fight against nationalism.
Absolutely. Beatrice, you have the last word. You have the last word. And then when we wrap up, please all come on stage. There's going to be a group photo. Don't leave the room.
And also, if I can make another administrative announcement, since I have the microphone. When you go down, and if you have not done so, look at the posters and please give your ratings. That would be very important because it's a poster competition. And every day there are going to be different ones, right? So, I mean, to me, the whole discussion also here that we are having here just shows that we even lack a common language to really talk about these issues. Around climate, I think the language is by now clearer. Around nature and biodiversity and how to think about these markets, it is not really clear. And why do we lack a common language? Because I think there is no common analytical framework. So the attempt that I was trying to showcase here is an attempt to think about how would we think about these things in principle. And the answers that we are developing in the context of this paper that I mentioned, which will be eventually part of the Paris report, jurisdictional approach on the supply side here means large scale, maybe, depending on the size of the country, but it is essentially the government that decides and takes responsibility for the conservation projects. And so it could be, in the case of the Amazon, which is enormous, it could be state-based. But why do you do that? Because it does away with the problems of additionality. It basically internalizes the problems of leakage and additionality, which right now are so big because the projects tend to be very, very small and localized. And then, as Patrick was saying, the deforestation just takes place next door to the place that you are protecting. So it has to be larger in scale. And that's on the supply side. And on the demand side, we need more mandatory and less voluntary approaches. And that's certainly for the conservation, the ultimate mandatory would be a biodiversity contribution somehow per head, because we are all probably benefiting from biodiversity. So that would be right now my benchmark. Then we can go from there and say, some people are rich and others are not, etc.
Please join me in giving a round of applause for a very interesting panel.